This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books, research, and other interesting things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Rowan Somerville. He has an eclectic biography which includes a career at the BBC and at MTV, but most recently he is an author, mostly of fiction. He's published 2 novels, but today we're talking about a different kind of book, nonfiction. It's called simply Beat, and it's an examination of one of the most traumatic phases of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Second Intifada. I'm not going to give any more details away for now. Beat was published by Lilliput Press in 2017. Rowan Somerville, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's such a pleasure to be with you.
What drew you to this story? You write in the beginning that you didn't have any long-standing connection to Israel other than some Jewish friends. I'm not going to give away what happens at the end of the book. Yet, like most people from Western urban environments, you know some of the Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, but no particular connection. So what drew you to this? There's so many other conflicts out there, so many other stories.
Well, the first thing that drew me to it was this terrible bomb that happened in the Dolphinarium. Of course, at that time, there were bombs all the time or frequently, in the same way that we hear about terrible things going on in Syria and Iraq, and you don't necessarily notice them. You develop a thicker skin on this, this far away. But that one did get through, and I think there were 2 reasons. One of them is banal from my point of view. I think it was because they were young people waiting outside a nightclub, and I used to work at MTV, and I also used to be a DJ, and I suppose those simple things made me associate with them more and feel and understand what was going on and really think, oh my God, when it happened. Although, of course, it was peculiarly awful because they were young people. It was teen night outside the Dolphinarium. And because it was girls get in free before midnight, and it happened just before midnight, all the boys had let the girls go in ahead. So most of the injuries were of teenage girls. So, of course, that's going to get through. That got through to me initially, and then following this, there was a Palestinian man the next day, unconnected to the incident in any other way than living in the same country, and he was shot by, it was said, an Israeli settler. At least that's what all the witnesses said, but not the Israeli police. Strangely, they said it was a Palestinian man in a criminal activity. But the man shot, Mazan al-Jilani, was a pharmacist who had no connection with any criminal activity, nor was he actively involved in the Intifada or any political organization. He was shot in the neck as an act of random revenge. That's what I believe, and the witnesses did. And his family offered his heart for transplant the following day. And just after that, in forgive my pronunciation, the Tal HaShomer Hospital, just outside Tel Aviv, a surgeon called Yaakov Lavi performed a heart transplant. And at one point in the heart transplant, as happens, he had the heart of an Israeli Jew and the heart of a Palestinian Muslim. And I suppose he had what I think of as a secular epiphany, certainly something that impacted him about a very basic truth, which is so true it's almost a cliche. And that was that all the things that separated these 2 beings were constructed, were man-made, probably, human-made, certainly. And that was what inspired me. It really inspired me, the combination with this horrific act, followed by an act that seemed to have some grace,
Heart is obviously a metaphor here for much bigger things, and it does resonate for you personally, given your biography. It's mentioned that your parents were pioneering cardiologists.
They were, and I grew up in a household where cardiology was the leitmotif. I mean,
should we say ubiquitous?
Ubiquitous.
Even in the refrigerator.
It is true that many times in the family refrigerator there were human hearts or bits of human hearts on the top shelf. That sounds macabre, but they were there because when my mother in particular lost a patient, she would not let go of the heart until she understood exactly what was going on so she could stop it going on. We have to remember, we take it for granted now in 2017, almost all heart disease is treatable. The final treatment of heart disease is a heart transplant, but almost all of it is. When I was born and growing up, the number one killer in our world was heart disease. Now it isn't. And the reason it isn't is because of people like my parents and people like Yakov Lavie and people all over the world, cardiologists, who stopped it through research. And so, of course, when I heard about this heart moving, you know, it was symbolically so potent because on that very kind of Oprah Winfrey level, I saw in it, and I don't say that cynically, I saw in it a symbol that could heal the world.
Let me go back just to remind our listeners, this is a bombing that happened in 2001. It's a long time ago. Did you hear about the story then and it sat with you for 10 years, I think, until you started writing the book? Or did you hear it later on and project yourself back there and say, I have to go and learn about this story?
I heard about it. I remember exactly where I was, like everyone in Tel Aviv who was alive then or sentient, pretty much that I've spoken to, remembers where they were when that particular bomb happened.
Including
and many
me?
people could feel it. It's sort of like the assassination of Kennedy or something like that. Maybe not so salient, but I remember where I was in London, which was, you know, in my office, not very far from where we are in the centre of London now. And it just impacted, it came through. So it sat with me and I faxed, that's how long ago it was, the surgeon Yakov Lavie straight as soon as I heard about the transplant, and I had a reply from him. And originally I was thinking of a documentary because that's what I did. But I couldn't quite find a form and certainly not the funding. And it sat with me like an obsession. And I remember going to my agent and saying my next book is going to be about this. And my agent's husband was the head of the foreign desk for the Times and had been the Jerusalem correspondent for many years. And she had said, just don't do it. You know, don't do it. No one wants your
Why
comments.
not?
No one really wants your comments. Everyone's been talking about it for ages. No one wants to buy the book anyway. You know nothing about the situation. What are you going to add? Plus, you're going to have an awful time doing it.
Was you right?
I don't think it was an awful time. It's very interesting. This book was published first in Ireland in the summer, in June, and had a very good reception and the best reviews I've ever had. Stellar. I couldn't get it published in the US, and I couldn't get it published in the UK in a conventional manner. And it was very curious because in the US I was getting replies, and I can quote them, but things like, this book is amazing, it should win a prize, but we don't want to publish it.
What was it they liked about it, and what was the reason why they didn't want to publish it?
Well, I can give you one example, but I don't want that example. Well, I'll just give you the example, but it's not the answer to your question. On one of the editors had been so complimentary about the book that my agent, David Kuhn, had written to him and said, look, you love it so much, why aren't you publishing it? And he had written back totally candidly saying, we found the books that are obviously pro-Israel do better for us. Now, my book is not anti-Israel. I mean, I'm as against being anti-Israel as I am being anti-Nigerian, or anti-Irish. And, it certainly isn't. There are criticisms, but you've seen it. It's also, if it's possible to be balanced, in this world.
You fell into the clutches of the politicization of journalism and literature, and maybe you're a victim of it. But let's talk about the actual content of the book. I want to get into some of the insights that you bring because, you really explore very deeply the characters who play the central role in this tragedy. You tell the story of one of the victims, a 16-year-old Russian immigrant named Mariana. And her father explains that they felt very alienated. They considered leaving Israel, but then when this tragedy happened, they decided they wanted to stay. And as you point out, many of the victims were former Soviet immigrants. What is it about such a horrible experience, such suffering and loss, that makes people more connected rather than wanting to flee from a place?
There's so many points in what you raised. The first one is also, I think that very much I'm coming to the whole thing from a point of view of feeling more than politics or analysis. And most of the victims were former Soviet immigrants. And let's also remember that most of those young people waiting outside hadn't made the decision to come. Their parents had made the decision. And why had their parents made the decision? Well, my belief is that they'd done it for the reasons that most people emigrate, which is to give their children or themselves a better life, a safer life, a better education, all those things. And for that particular family, it was very, very poignant because I spoke to the father, and he had originally came from what we might call Siberia, around that. And he said when he arrived, it was so alien, the entire culture, to him. And it was miles away from anything he or his grandparents. I don't know, and I wouldn't like to say this one way or the other, if they had had very much connection with Jewish culture before, this particular family. I don't know. But one thing was for sure is he felt no connection at that point. His daughter, however, really loved it and felt happier than she'd ever felt. And so he and his wife had said, okay, well, let's wait till they're old enough, and then we'll go home. And he said once this had happened, this terrible tragedy, he said, nothing, we are here, this is our home, this is where our roots are, nothing can drag us away. And so therefore, the strategic reason for the bomb, which was, as far as I was informed by, a very, very good source, the bomb was done by Hamas then, and the reason for the bomb was not because they were Jewish, but because they were Israeli. And I don't make that differentiation as if it would make any difference to the victims or the families, or actually to me, it's a political notion. Now, they were going, you've arrived here, this is what happened, and this isn't your country. What's it happened is it's made roots grow. And I believe, on a sociological basis, but you two would know this much better than me, that it was part of what caused a re-examination from other Israelis going, hold on a minute, are we treating all this new influx of immigrants the same way we're treating other people, or are they sort of lower citizens and we're kind of prejudiced against them? I think it did exactly the opposite, And other than the joy that you might feel in a terrible marriage where you hate each other and you see the other one trip up and hurt themselves, that kind of bitter joy, I don't think it had any positive act whatsoever.
Positive in what sense?
For the perpetrators.
In other words, they wanted people to say, this is horrible, we're leaving, and you didn't see any of that. It only made the connection stronger.
It caused this influx of people, to be better accepted.
More embraced in
it
society.
Also, I believe, was a final nail in the coffin of the liberal views. Lots of liberals were pushed away. It was absolute manna for Netanyahu. And I don't mean that he was pleased, because he's a human being, and despite the fact on a political level I actually despise what he does, I'm not saying that he was happy about those things, but politically it was manna.
Going to the region, to Israel and Palestine, talking to these people, that must have been, difficult on a personal level, but also, you were probably overwhelmed with a lot of information about the intricacies of the conflict. As you said earlier, your publisher warned you about, your agent, sorry. Your previous two books were novels, and this is non-fiction. Why didn't you write it as a novel? Why didn't you fictionalize the story? It might have given you a lot more poetic license to tell the story the way you see fit.
I suppose it was a process of understanding for me, and I think I was very motivated when the first chapter describes the young people waiting outside the nightclub. And I interviewed lots of their friends and family, and what goes on is really well researched. So if there's a conversation, it's about something that I heard was going on, even down to the colour fingernail polish that was being worn. Or I think it was the tragedy of the young humanity lost made me want to make that bit a sort of memorial to them. I'm not saying that I have the right to, the way a sculptor can make a beautiful memorial, or that anyone asked me to, but I was motivated to, and it's very important. I wept so many times writing it, because of what was done. And when you say it was all very difficult, it was also surprisingly amazing for me, because I'd never been to Israel.
Or Palestine, I assume.
I'd never been to Israel or Palestine, no. And I think that I hadn't expected to make, the whole journey was very profound for me, as it is for everyone. It's not just Jews who go to Israel and feel profoundly affected, It is a profoundly affecting place. And I'm not just talking about politics. It's also, as you know, Tel Aviv is an amazing place, but the amazingness isn't surface. And then when you go to the West Bank, it's extraordinary. It's a different, there is something special. I don't want to make it all spiritual, that there's, here's the 3 Abrahamic religions, they're all here and da-da-da, there must be something. There's something special, no doubt.
How did you cope with all this emotional outpouring? I mean, even reading the book, there are moments when I also teared up, I'm not embarrassed to say. I think particularly when the family of Julani make the decision to donate his organs. I found that very moving. But you must have had moments like this all the time reading the book, and you said you wept. How did you cope with all those emotions?
I just cry. It's...
I have a theory about writing that if you cry while writing something, your reader will cry while reading it.
Well, I cried a lot in the first chapter. Remember, I'd seen the people and their children, and I found the meeting with the family of Saeed Hotari, who was the bomber, was very, very profound as well in ways I hadn't expected.
Tell us about that meeting. It sounds somewhat scary and somewhat overwhelming.
I think that the scariness came from my projection. I think it's worth noting that I'm not a journalist, nor am I a historian. I didn't access anyone through fixers or anything like that. I found the people through, friends, and it's described in the book, how I accessed them. So I was probably safer in Calkilia, in the house of the Hotaris, than I am in my car driving down the motorway in the UK. But I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I'd be chained to a radiator for a month or something. I think a proper journalist would have understood what the scenario was. So that was the scary part, which was, I think, entire projection on my part. Not to say, as my friends in Ramallah told me, they think everything is safe, but things can get dangerous just like that. And I think that's the same all over.
Drawing on that, I would also like to know, tell us the process about approaching these people. It was a while after the actual event, and it must have been very difficult for them, this English writer coming to the region out of the blue for the first time. They have their own experience with foreigners coming to tell them what to do and how they should resolve the conflict. I'm sure that they dealt you with a great deal of suspicion. Tell us a bit about the first interactions you had with your sources.
Okay, so I found them. I was helped by the cast and crew of the people who made the Palestinian version of Sesame Street. And that was not through some political weirdness. It's just that I used to work in television, so you have contacts. I worked in live television. People, they were all they were doing was busy talking about, item number 22, how are we going to do this, that, and the other, and then, so what are you doing here? How can we help you? And I said, look, I'm trying to get in contact with this person, but I don't speak Arabic. And the person,
and by the way, he's a family of a suicide bomber.
Yeah, and they were like, honestly, it's like there are people just trying to get on with their life. They don't get up in the morning like most Palestinians and think, I hate Israelis, or get up and carry on and think about, get up in the morning and think, how's my kids? Or, that annoying woman at work, am I going to have to deal with her today? Or, how am I going to do the show properly? But nevertheless, there is a big difference to how you might get help by strangers over there, and a difference to how you might get help by strangers here in the UK, and I was helped a great deal for no other reason than the love of helping a stranger. And so, anyway, that's how I got the address, that's how I phoned, and off I went, and he was there to meet me. I saw the family on 2 occasions. I spent many, many hours with them.
Tell us about this very sensitive moment in one of the conversations that you're having with the father and the brother, and you are overwhelmed by thinking about the victims of this bombing. And you have this moment where you say to them, do you not comprehend, or how do you deal with the fact that children were taken away from their parents? And it's a very tense moment. How did that come about, and how did it play out?
This is a very difficult moment just to seize on in one moment here, I wonder I don't know how much time we have because it needs to be contextualized, but seeing as you've asked the question, I'll just try and answer it frankly. We had discussed a great deal about lots of things, not so much political, but I'd been wanting to get a sense of who this young man was and whether he was sort of, an Islamist or a fanatical and he wasn't particularly religious as far as I could hear, or whether he was absolutely committed to the struggle or had personal experiences of oppression, which I think almost everyone has on that side of the fence. But that wasn't it. We discussed so many things, and every now and then, when a journalist goes after one of those awful things that happens and speaks to the family, there's part of the theatre going on. You know better than we do here in the UK, but we had some that, without the media, terrorism is just a psychotic crime. Someone driving through a group of people in a crowd, or, in the last thing that happened in the UK, one of the girls who was stabbed was in my brother's restaurant, which is a tiny little restaurant. But without the media behind it, it's just a crime. And that's all carefully organised so that what the father of the bomber said after that was scripted, to an extent. So what I was trying to do was getting to his real feelings. But nevertheless, there are also... You can go into, we've been this and that, and, this has gone on, and they're all true things, but they don't get to the real feeling. And I was thinking, look, I've spent so many times with the families of those people who died in the bomb. And I am actually sitting in front of a father with the mother in the kitchen, with relations around me who are grieving for a lost son. That was the reality in the room, although they never mentioned it. And I said, how you're feeling about your son, because they didn't know. I can tell you for sure that they didn't know it was happening. And had they knew he was going to do it, they would have stopped it. Because you could tell by the interactions of the family that the first thing that was going on there is the first thing that goes on in your and my family, that you love your kids and that's what you want them to be okay, however old they are. But I did say to him, you love your child so much, do you ever give a thought that his actions have impacted on so many mothers and fathers and brothers, and they're sitting in kitchens just like you, feeling that sorrow? And, I look back on it. Someone was helping me translate, and he said, don't ask that question. And I thought it was because of what happened next, which was the man was very angry. The father was very, very angry for a while. And I was a bit scared just because of the anger I'd created, and he wanted me to leave. But actually, I think in retrospect that it was wrong of me, the way I did it. I thought I was somehow representing those people, and I had this idea that it was the brave thing to do. All I was really doing was pushing at a scar, and it didn't help anyone, really. He came back afterwards, and we were calmed down, and we walked on his rooftop where, the wall or separation barrier or whatever euphemism is currently in use, is right there, all around Calcilia. And he was pointing over there and he goes, you see that land there? That is mine. That's actually my bit of land there. And, his younger children have never seen the sea and they're 14 kilometers away. Never seen it. So none of those things justify. They do not justify. And I'm, really wouldn't give any justification. But that's what happened. You really need to read the book to get a good idea of that. I don't think I've done it properly.
Do you want the reader to take away a good human story about people with, frustrations and hopes? Or is there also perhaps, I don't know if political, but it's sort of an educational dimension to it? You want your reader to take the same journey of understanding the region better as you did?
Yeah, there's no way I can tell any Israeli or Palestinian anything really that they don't know or haven't experienced on a different level. What I am doing is simply showing my journey and, trying to explain how I felt and being not as honest as I can, but being honest about the experiences I had, including finding out that my grandfather was Jewish,
You're the spoiler in this
sorry.
conversation. No, I was trying to be good for our readers. But how did that change your thinking?
I have to watch out because I'm not worried about anything, but because some of my views are, as I said, quite Oprah Winfrey, So it's like, and they'll be so easily parodied and laughed at, but it explained Okay, here's one. It explained why I feel so comfortable around Jews. You know, does that, on the other hand, there is nothing genetic, that I believe, because I did lots of research, and the greatest researcher currently in it happens to be an Israeli, who said to me, it's totally untrue. I mean, you probably know all the haplotype or the genome. He said it's totally invented, all the Kohani stuff. It's just absolutely bogus. There is no Jewish gene, So therefore what I'm saying there is, but I do feel that, and it wasn't part of my culture, Mother did not know her father. And it turns out through family research that my grandfather had, his family had given money to a synagogue in Birmingham. Now, that's as good example of being a definite Jew as anything,
But I think it's interesting. We're talking a lot about crossing borders. You crossed a border of your identity you didn't know existed. You crossed the fence many times. I want to talk about, as a final question, one of the sections in your book towards the end, which is devoted to the history of heart transplants, actually. I mean, given that this is partly a personal journey related back to your parents who are cardiologists, and you explore, of course, the fact that the first human heart transplant was performed by a South African, Dr. Christian Barnard. And so much of that story is symbolic, too, because it also took place in a conflict, a racial conflict. Can you tell how you tied that in? And look at the symbolism of this?
I didn't need to tie it in. What I did was articulate the ways that the similarities were resonating to me, and...
What were those similarities for listeners who don't know?
The first heart transplant was in 1967. We've just, it's just been 50 years. It was a couple of days ago from now that it's 50 years that it happened. And it was in 1967 was the absolute heyday of apartheid in terms of its ideological raging. It was at its sort of in its prime, as it were, unquestioned to a large extent, except by those who were against it. And Christian Barnard was Afrikaans. His father was a preacher, and the first transplant that he wanted to do was from a black person to a white person. It wasn't because he wanted more white people to be advanced in. I mean, there are sociological reasons. On the one side, there were more white people with heart disease because they were sitting around eating all the good food, and there were more black people who had brain injuries because they were doing more manual labor without proper, But for him, he just wanted to be first. Now, he wasn't allowed to do the first heart transplant because they were saying, look, what's the world going to say if we're seen to, forget it. Wait, you can't do it across racial lines like that, because we have to remember that apartheid means, separate, different. And its entire basis rests on there being an absolute difference between a white person and another sort of person. It's insane, because Japanese people were classed as white people, but Chinese people were classed as black people. It's like, and then there was a tremendous difference if you couldn't actually tell, But when it did happen, the first one, when they got Denise Darvell, who was a young Christian woman who was the donor for Leo Washkansky, who is a 50-something-year-old Lithuanian Jew. No problem about those divisions. Gender, would you think, was a big one. Those aren't taboo, because the colour was right, despite the fact those two people were not the same colour when you use colour as it relates to your eyes. But that wasn't a problem. But so that was successful, and because Barnard became the most famous man in the world for a while, when he got the opportunity to do another transplant where the donor was black, for the sake, he was actually what's called Cape Coloured or Cape Malay, and the recipient, Phil Blaylock, who was a dentist, was white, no one could stop him. He was told not to do it, and he said, don't tell me what to do. And so then for the first time in apartheid history, there was a white man walking around with a black heart. Now, what did that mean when you sit on the white-only bench? Because for the first time, that black heart was going to the theatre and enjoying a life it didn't. And I felt that image was such a powerful symbol that it was corrosive of the hypocrisy of apartheid. I can see you nodding there, and I'm just wondering, which doesn't come across very well in radio. I mean, do we carry on? Because we're into an area which is very hotly contested now, a really dangerous area. Part? Well, because I suppose that where that brings us now is what happens in the book is there comes a link of, wait a minute, you're talking about Israel, and you're talking about Palestine, and you're talking about the West Bank and nationhood and identity and hearts, and now you're talking about apartheid. And,
I just thought we were talking about heart transplants.
Well, those two things, that's why they don't they didn't attract to each other in questions of nationhood and identity for entirely random reasons.
Right, but I think this brings home in a way how much those nation and identity aspects may be inherent to our personalities, but they are separate from our bodies. In other words, when it comes to saving lives with hearts, they cross national boundaries.
Yeah, and that national boundaries, nationality is entirely constructed. I'm Irish and English. When I'm in Ireland, people think I'm English. My daughter is Italian and Irish and English, but her passport's American. It's like, come on, it's all these things are just, and what is that Britishness that I have? It's entirely invented. It's like Richard the Lionheart, invented. Robert the Bruce in Scotland, invented. Knights of the Round Table, Thanksgiving in the US, completely invented. Exile in Israel, completely invented. They are important myths for which you create a nation around.
So I think that your next book should be about Richard the Lionheart.
Anyway, this is a book about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also many other things that you can obviously take away from it. It's called Beat, The True Story of a Suicide Bomb and a Heart by Rowan Somerville. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Neer Institute for the generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Remey Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. We have also launched a fundraising campaign. Just go to our website, www.telavivreview.org, and please consider donating. We need your help to survive. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive. There are more than 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow us, me and Dalia, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.